Welcome to this webinar on the fundamentals of equity work. It is the first in a series of 2. The second webinar is called Practices of Equity Work for Educator Teams. Both webinars are designed for teams of educators, paraprofessionals, general education teachers, intervention specialists, related services personnel, and other educators. I am Margit Dudek, the facilitator of this webinar. I'll be providing an overview and posing discussion questions. To get the most out of the webinar, I recommend that you stop the video briefly each time there are questions to have a discussion among yourselves. Spend about 5 to 10 minutes discussing each set of questions. Then turn the video back on. The ideas for this webinar came from an interview with Dr. Colleen Capper. Dr. Capper is professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She is co-founder of Integrated Comprehensive Systems for Equity and co-founder and co-director of the National Leadership for Social Justice Institute and Academy. Her research and teaching focus on systems change in educator preparation, in schools, and in districts to advance the learning of all students and to eliminate opportunity and achievement gaps. She is featured speaking in her own voice throughout this webinar. Thank you for your school's interest in and work on educational equity. Your interest shows that your school, with the support of your district, is already doing some very important things. First, you are recognizing the need for equity work. Second, you understand the importance of collaboration. As you already know, collaboration allows your team members to learn side by side and to learn from one another. Through participation in TBTs, IEP teams, and classroom instructional teams, which are sometimes called CoPlan to CoServe teams, you are making time to build on one another's insights and expertise. These steps are essential to your efforts to make your school better for everyone. What are the fundamentals of equity work? The fundamental ideas and practices that make equity an essential part of school improvement are seemingly simple, but they turn out actually to be complex. They fit to 5 broad categories. Definitions. What is equity? What is equality? What is inclusion? In what ways are they the same, and in what ways do they differ? Culture building. What is needed in order to create an inclusive culture focused on equity? Team building and instruction. How can we commit to and use a CoPlan to CoServe model? Student assignment. How can we create heterogeneous learning environments? Sustainability. How can we maintain our focus on equity? In this webinar, we consider the first 2 categories in depth, and we touch on the third more briefly. In the next webinar in the series, we focus on practices with more extensive discussion of co-planning to CoServe, student assignment, and sustainability. Our goal is to move from abstract ideas to concrete practices. Putting these practices in place in your schools is the goal. As Colleen Capper said,
what we say is that we have all the expertise in the school to do the work. It's already there. We already have the resource and expertise, but it's typically siloed, and we don't know how to bring it together to really come around the table and really build each other's capacity to work with a range of students.
What is equity? What is equality? Let's start by making sure we understand some foundational concepts. Equality and equity are 2 of the most important. Each involves a way of thinking about fairness for everyone. When we think of fairness in terms of equality, our intent is to treat everyone the same. Everyone gets the same opportunities, the same experiences, and so on. When we think of fairness in terms of equity, our intent is to give each person what he or she needs in order to be successful. Which of these ways of thinking works best? Equality works well when everyone already has the same abilities and needs to start off with. In this case, giving everyone the same thing produces fairness. But When everyone has different abilities and needs, giving them the same thing does not produce a fair outcome. Equity attempts to equalize outcomes by meeting everyone's needs in ways that respond to those needs. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and it is more likely to produce fairness. What is inclusion? How does it fit with equity? Inclusion means giving everyone access to a common environment and culture. We might think of environment as a place, and culture as the ways of being in that place. With inclusion, everyone has a right to be in the place and participate in its culture. Furthermore, the culture values everyone's participation and contributions. Mutual respect and cooperative action are the hallmarks of an inclusive environment and culture. Equitable schools provide meaningful access to inclusive environments and cultures. How does this work? By being equitable, these schools give each person, student and adults alike, what he or she needs in order to participate in meaningful ways and make meaningful contributions. What specific things do these schools give to their members? They give them respect, time to learn, consideration of their circumstances, and the presumption that they are sensible and competent. Creating an inclusive culture does not guarantee equity, but it is a prerequisite for creating equity. What do we mean by attitudes? Attitudes are our positions or points of view about particular things. Those things can be facts, ideas, people, organizations, almost anything. Attitudes affect our behaviors, and our behaviors affect the social organizations, including the schools and school districts we create. When we share attitudes with others in our organizations, our collective attitudes shape our organizational culture. One of the wonderful things about attitudes is that we can change them. As a group of educators, for instance, we can change our attitudes towards students with disabilities or towards students living in poverty. Our values help us change our attitudes, behaviors, and the norms of our school or district culture. Values are what we hold dear, our fundamental beliefs and commitments. As it turns out, many of us value some of the same things: family, relationships, hard work, and a sense of fairness. But our attitudes and behaviors, the ways we act, don't always line up with our values. One important way to change our attitudes and behaviors is to examine them in light of our values. Do we value relationships? If so, are we acting in ways that make our relationships healthy and productive? Do we value fairness? If so, are the ways we treat our students and colleagues fair? What needs to change in order to bring our attitudes and behaviors into line with our fundamental values? Colleen Capper talks about this shift as a change from a deficit-based version of attitudes and behaviors to a strength-based version.
When you move from a deficit system that our current system is to more proactive, addressing student needs, student strengths and capabilities, and being more proactive, then fewer students need to be labeled with disabilities in the first place. So I think being very cautious about when we're at the referral stage, like how did we get to that stage in the beginning in the first place, and there are not other factors that's biasing our understanding about students getting the label. And then we also know that if you look at your low ability groups, even in general education or in your low track classes, we know that those students are overrepresented with students, again, with disabilities, students of color, overrepresented for students from low income homes. I think we often end up blaming student achievement on, families. They're not involved. Family's not involved. They will just be more involved, and the student not be low achieving. But then what we know is that we often define family involvement based on, middle to upper white class and white values. And so what research is very clear is that families experiencing poverty, families of color, and families of color who are experiencing poverty are very involved in their child's education. They very much value education, and in fact, they value education even more because they see it as a way out of, especially if they're experiencing poverty. And so that's important to know and like to value that because it might not look the same. Families might not be able to be on the PTO, volunteer in the classroom, show up at meetings in the middle of the day. And so that doesn't mean they're not involved. So I think having that understanding about different kids' backgrounds and valuing the funds of knowledge, again, that kids bring to the classroom, and then recognizing that if our lens is coming from that white middle class perspective, that, that's something we have to think about and value, that all the different ways that families are involved in their education. I think so. Then also that should also signal to us that we should be advocates for all kids. So I think we say that, but especially for families who may have more difficulty accessing the system for whatever reason. And so being really proactive about helping families understand the system and how to be proactive in supporting their student in the system.
One more important idea to add to the mix is the idea of norms. Norms are our routine ways of doing things in a particular culture, like the culture of our school or district. Norms are what we think of as normal within that culture. So, for instance, greeting students at the door might be a norm. Many of our norms promote inclusion, but some do not. For example, if we normally greet girls by commenting on their appearance, and we normally greet boys by commenting on their accomplishments, our greeting of students norms convey prejudiced attitudes. If we spelled out those attitudes, they might be something like this. I think girls should look their best. I think boys should do well in school and in their jobs. But does this set of attitudes fit with our values about fairness? Here's another example from Dr. Capper.
What is your current model saying about race in your school or about social class? Like, what message are your kids getting about social class or race or ability just by what they're seeing is happening around them about what happens to kids with disabilities? Like, where are the kids with disabilities? Like, why does John need to go down to that room? Or why is there this room down the hall?
Here's a good place to stop the video and talk for a few minutes. Have you ever felt excluded in a social situation? Perhaps when you were growing up? What were the specifics? How did it feel to be excluded? Did your exclusion have to do with one or more of your characteristics? For instance, were you excluded because of your gender, or your age, or your family's income level? At the time, did you think your exclusion from the social situation was fair? What do you think about it now? As the discussion about being excluded probably revealed, some instances of exclusion are intentional, but others are not. When we are the people who are doing the exclusion, it's much easier to change our intentional acts of exclusion than our unintentional ones. But both types matter, and we need to change both types. Why? The value we place on relationships and the value we place on fairness require us to make these changes. How can we change our unintentional acts of exclusion? First, we need to identify them. Here's an example. Let's imagine a student who says, "I didn't bring a pencil today." What does this statement mean to us? An assets perspective would automatically conclude, he really wants to learn. So he is risking my annoyance to try to get what he needs in order to learn. That shows perseverance and courage. From that perspective, we'd probably thank the student for taking action on his own behalf and provide him with a pencil. But maybe that's not what we automatically conclude. Perhaps we hear the oft-repeated lament, "Why can't he ever remember a pencil? What's the matter with him?" This second response illustrates a deficit perspective. The example shows that how we think about what we are seeing and hearing can cause us to act in ways that include or exclude others. Giving a pencil to the student includes him in the class. Yelling at him for forgetting a pencil excludes him. Our second step in the process of correcting our unintentional acts of exclusion is to change our ways of thinking. 2 ways of thinking are important to consider: deficit thinking and assets thinking. It's time to turn off the video again and turn and talk. Spend about 10 minutes discussing your answers to the following questions. What are some ways we unintentionally think about students from a deficit perspective? How can we turn a deficit's way of thinking into an asset's way of thinking? How can we change our vocabulary in ways that focus on assets rather than on deficits? How can we change our school and classroom practices in ways to focus on assets rather than deficits? When a team of educators works to change how they all think about students, moving from a deficits to an assets perspective, they are taking an important step toward creating an inclusive culture. Why? They are also taking an important step towards producing more equitable school outcomes. Why? In very simple terms, a deficit's perspective leads to blame. If a child has a deficit, he or she is to blame for lags or gaps in his or her learning. And if the child is to blame, then the educator is off the hook. But it's critical for every educator to be on the hook for every single child. That's inclusive. A deficit's perspective also causes educators to lower their expectations for children with supposed deficits. We feel sorry for them, we give them a break. Unfortunately, these ways of thinking lead us to offer fewer learning opportunities and to reduce the child's chances for success. How do we turn a deficits-based culture into an assets-based culture? We do it by turning around our thinking. Instead of presuming students' incompetence or laziness or lack of motivation or bad attitude, we presume their competence, energy, motivation, and willingness to learn. Then, once we make the presumption of competence, we accept responsibility for students' learning challenges and gaps. In other words, if a child appears not to understand an idea, we take responsibility for teaching that idea. If a child appears uninterested in what we are teaching, we find a way to build his or her interest. And we ask others on our educator teams to do exactly the same things. On this slide is an excerpt from a conversation among members of a TBT. The team members are talking about an 11th grade student named Warren. For this turn and talk activity, start by reading the whole conversation. Then unpack the conversation one statement at a time with 1 or 2 people in your group. Decide if each point made in the conversation comes from an assets or a deficits perspective. If you think it's coming from a deficits perspective, talk about how you could turn it around so that it might reflect an assets perspective instead.
Warren put his head down on the desk again today. I don't know how I can prepare him for the ACT if he won't stay awake in class.
Weird. He is so active in my class. When something interests him, he really gets involved.
Well, maybe English doesn't interest him. Boys tend to be better at math and science anyway.
Or maybe he's tired because his job at the convenience store keeps him out until midnight.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. His parents ought to put limits on his work hours.
In any case, he does like and do well in science. What if we looked at ways to connect your English content to stuff I'm teaching in science?
As we've seen, an inclusive culture works best when educators think about students from an assets perspective. There are also practices in districts, schools, and classrooms that help establish and sustain an inclusive culture. Here are some of them. Employing a diverse staff. Inviting parents to play meaningful roles in the life of the school. Using a curriculum that draws on the cultural contributions of people of different races, ethnicities, social classes, and national origins. Allowing students to access information in a variety of ways. Giving students opportunities to share differing points of view openly. There are many other practices also that help build and sustain inclusion. Dr. Capper shares an example from the state of Wisconsin, where she lives and works.
I know in the Madison School District they have a position called the bilingual resource teacher, and it's a person who's not a certified teacher. They might call a bilingual resource person. I'm not sure the last title, but they're not certified as a teacher. I think they might have an undergraduate degree, but to be honest, I think when they first started, they did not. And so they're truly a community person who knew the language. So if they say a Spanish speaker, and so they hired that person into the school district. And that's exactly how that person functions, is that it's conduit between the school and the community, helping with translation, communicating back to families, help them understand the system. And I think that, and so that's the first step. So then they're integral to the process, and they still have these positions in the district. And then they took it a step further, and then they offered licensing options for these bilingual resource support teachers to become certified a bilingual teacher in the system. So it was a way for them to grow their own ELL teachers in the system. And so to me, like, that's an ideal situation right there, because you're really building on the capacity of the educator in that position.
How does the CoPlan to CoServe approach contribute to an inclusive culture? Educators CoPlan to CoServe when two or more of them work together to develop, deliver, and assess instruction for a group of diverse learners who are all enrolled in the same general education classroom. The educators can include any combination of general educators, special educators, parapros, student teachers, related service personnel, or volunteer tutors. This approach works best when there is strong district-level support for it and strong school-level support for it. As the OPEP guidelines, Improving Results for All Children, Guidelines for Ohio Paraprofessionals Supporting the Education of Children with Disabilities and Learning Difficulties, state, it is critical that time be set aside to facilitate team communication and collaborative activities. Intentional strategies for communicating and planning are important for successful team functioning. A successful team will lead to successful students. What do the guidelines mean by the phrase, a successful team? I think they mean a team that has the ability to craft learning solutions for individual students, small groups of students, whole classrooms, and entire grade levels. Over time, a school and district become a successful team by intentionally shaping how instruction is delivered across the whole system to provide a culture of collaborative learning among students and educators alike. And why is co-planning important? Co-planning empowers teams to meet the needs of all students in effective ways. Without co-planning, lessons that are developed may address the needs of just some of the students in the classroom, not all of them. Co-planning is especially important for the students whose approaches to academic or social-emotional learning are atypical. Co-planning makes co-teaching possible. According to Chapman and Hart-Hyatt, co-teaching is an effective, evidence-based instructional strategy in which two or more caring professionals share responsibility for a group of students and work collaboratively to add instructional value to enhance their efforts. How can educators make co-teaching happen routinely in their classrooms? Dr. Capper has some advice.
If you have 4 or 5 teachers at 4th grade, so you'd have the 4th grade CoPlan to CoServe team. I think in Ohio you call them teacher-based teams. And then on that CoPlan to CoServe team, depending on student needs at the 4th grade, you would have maybe a special educator on that team. Maybe the ELL person is assigned to that team if there are students labeled ELL. Maybe there's a speech pathologist on that team, maybe the OT or PT. And so then that CoPlan to CoServe team meets on a regular basis, and then their work is lesson design, designing lessons around the range of learners in 4th grade. They wrap their arms around all the learners who are in 4th grade as an example. And so then paraprofessionals, we think, should be part of that team. And then that's one way to develop the capacity for paraprofessionals, is that then you're learning with each other, and then you're learning in practice. So it's not like you're having to learn something over here and then bring it and transfer it into your practice as a teacher. You're building each other's capacity around the table when you're meeting about how to support students with language needs across the day, rather than just, being pulled out down the hall, which is what's happening often with pull-out services. So it's not that the special education teacher in the resource room is not a great teacher. They are a great teacher. How can we bring that special ed expertise to bear across all students in that fourth grade? Or the student, teacher of students labeled ELL is a great teacher down the hall, but instead of having her down the hall doing ELL pull-out, she's part of that team and is and then having conversations where they're designing lessons about how to support all students around language.
And what are some ways for including parapros in CoPlan to CoServe? Here's what Dr. Capper has to say.
You can list all your paraprofessionals working with your teams, and have your paraprofessionals list all their areas of expertise. What expertise do they have or they feel comfortable with? And we don't even know, they might have a nephew who has some challenging behaviors that they've actually been very successful with, but we probably have not ever asked them that, what they see their areas of expertise as. And so getting all that down on the table, and then again, in that school, they're very much part of that school, those school teams, based on their paraprofessional expertise and based on the student needs. So now which team should those particular paraprofessionals be assigned to?
Here are some other contributions that parapros often make to CoPlan to CoServe meetings. Parapros often know a lot about the children, family members, and family situations in their communities. Parapros often know a lot about community values and norms. Many parapros can report on instructional and behavioral strategies they have used effectively in the past. Some parapros can provide information about how the same student functions in different classrooms and other school locations, such as the lunchroom or the playground. Wrapping up this webinar and preparing for the next, you might find it useful to ask yourself, what expertise might I bring to the table at meetings about an individual student or groups of students? What expertise am I hoping other educators will bring to the table? What inclusive practices does my school already employ? It's also useful to review basic concepts about equality, equity, and inclusion, as well as to think about how attitudes, values, and norms currently shape your educational practices, those of the other educators with whom you work, and those of colleagues in your school and district. How do these attitudes, values, and norms support equity and inclusion? How might they interfere with equity and inclusion? Thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar. If you were with a group of colleagues, I hope the webinar helped you get started on some productive conversations about equity work in educator teams. And if you found this experience useful, I hope you'll also consider watching the second webinar in this series, Practices of Equity Work for Educator Teams, as well as some of the other webinars that the Ohio Partnership for Excellence in Paraprofessional Preparation, OPEP, has to offer.